morning, everyone. So I'd like to start by asking you some hopefully easy questions. How many of you believe that democracies should protect individual rights by a show of hands? That equality of the law should protect everyone regardless of race, sex, or religion? All right, so we have almost universal acceptance of these values in this room, which is reassuring. And they seem obvious to us, but these values were hard-won by idealists who had to fight against the odds and pay a high price. And their most important weapon was free speech. And whatever cause you're here to advance today, free speech remains your most important tool as well. It's what allows us to advocate for peaceful change, to hold authority accountable, and to change our minds when we're confronted by better ideas. But free speech is under attack today. The great bulwark of liberty is crumbling. And to demonstrate what's at stake, I would like to talk about two dissidents, one who triumphed and one who didn't. So as you know, 35 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the end of communism and the rise of democracy in Eastern Europe. And yeah, applause. And in 1990, a triumphant Václav Havel stood before the US Congress and recounted the amazing story of how months ago he had been a political prisoner in a totalitarian country, but now who is the president, elected president of a country which had, as he said, complete freedom of speech. But Havel had actually paved that way with his Charter 77, a bold manifesto whose very first demand was free speech. And free speech became a driving force in what you might call a global winning streak for liberty around the world, one in which open democracies saw free speech as a competitive advantage against authoritarian states and where dictators were on the defensive. And then you had the World Wide Web, and there was this incredible optimism that technology would supercharge free speech and democracy and make the 21st century resistant to tyranny and censorship. And this is where our second story begins. This is Liu Xiaobo, a Chinese dissident who was so inspired by Charter 77 that he helped with Charter 08, which called for free speech and democracy in China. But unlike Havel, Liu would never see his vision realized. Instead, he would die in prison, and the Chinese Communist Party that put him there remains in power. So these two stories highlight the stark differences of our future, one based on openness and free speech, one on centralized control and censorship. And unfortunately today, it seems like authoritarians are leading the race. So communism might have been defeated in Russia, but under the former KGB agent Vladimir Putin, more people in Russia have been persecuted than under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. China has built the world's most sophisticated high-tech system of censorship in human history, and a new Charter 08 would very quickly be memory hold. But more worryingly, the very democracies that used to see free speech as a tool to undermine authoritarianism now see it as a threat, as a Trojan horse that emboldens authoritarianism. So in short, the golden age of free speech has receded, and we've entered into a free speech recession. What do I mean by a free speech recession? So let me give you some data points. At the Future of Free Speech that I run, we tracked developments in 22 open democracies, and as you can see, free speech restrictions are rising sharply. When we look globally, last year alone, 35 countries saw declines in free speech. Over the past decade, more than 6 billion people in almost 80 countries have seen their access to share and access information being eroded. But how are democracies undermining free speech today? So let me start with Europe, which after all is the birthplace of the printing press and the Enlightenment, but it's also a place with a growing emphasis on imposing top-down control of the public sphere, where unelected bureaucrats in Brussels are being given powers to define and enforce online laws to combat vague concepts such as hate speech and disinformation. And this has unintended consequences for the rest of the world. So countries like Russia and Venezuela, for instance, have weaponized European speech regulations to justify their own crackdown on dissent. And the EU is actually even trying to impose its speech regulations on the US. You might call it an attempt at moderation without representation. But the US is not immune to the free speech recession either. Under the Biden administration, we saw attempts to pressurize social media platforms to remove constitutionally protected speech. Trump has repeatedly threatened to revoke media licenses to punish his critics. So this leaves us with a question: what do we do about the free speech recession? How do we rebuild the bulwark of liberty? And I strongly think that we need to renew a global movement, one that is fiercely committed to what I would call an old school civil libertarian ideal of free speech, which emphasizes nonpartisanship and commitment to principle and consistency. Because history shows us that even with the best intentions, centralized control over speech always protects the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Or to quote the great Frederick Douglass, the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And Douglas' vision is our mission. At the Future of Free Speech, our strict commitment to principle and nonpartisanship has given us an outsized impact. It has enabled us to defeat a blasphemy ban in Denmark, to halt a fake news law in Cyprus, to help defeat a hate speech bill in New Zealand, and make positive changes to big tech, to name a few examples. But in today's world, it's not enough to argue that censorship is a cure worse than the disease. We have to show concretely that fighting bad speech with better speech is more than just a tired cliche, that free speech works for those who are concerned. So at the Future of Free Speech, we have created a counter-speech toolkit that helps empower people to fight back against hate speech without resorting to censorship. We've trained hundreds of activists and students around the world to use this counter-speech toolkit. We're even developing an AI-powered version of it. We're also in the process of creating tools that put control back into the hands of social media users, cutting out the need for centralized oversight by big tech and government. But these are just small steps in the larger fight to reverse the free speech recession. To create a truly resilient culture of free speech, we need more voices to join the cause. To shape a future where the next Liu Xiaobo isn't thrown into prison, but sworn into office. Where democratic leaders work to protect rather than restrict the right of dissent of the very people they represent. That future depends on us, those who still have the freedom to speak. So I hope you'll join us and use your voice to defend the voiceless. Thank you very much.